Okay, so sorry about the abrupt ending to the last video. My internet went out, and so kind of went crazy. Apparently, yeah, I don't know what happened. But anyways, so where it got cut off was right here. So I just want to kind of go over this slide and take it on from there. So again, whenever we refer to a nerve, we're talking about a bunch of axons that are wrapped together in a protective sheath. Okay, so it's this bundle of axons that is carrying information in a single direction, or the same direction to and from the central nervous system. We have 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and these nerves connect directly to the brain. And we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves that connect directly to the spinal cord. Okay. So we have a little animation video here that kind of shows the location of some of these nerves.
This view of the underside of the brain reveals the 12 cranial nerves, which carry sensory and motor information to and from the brain. Cranial nerve 1, the olfactory nerve, carries sensory information about smell from receptors in the nose. Cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve. It conducts sensory information from the eye to the brain. Cranial nerve 3, the ocular motor nerve, is a motor nerve that controls the contraction and relaxation of the eye muscles. Cranial nerve 4, the trochlear nerve, also controls eye muscle function. Cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve, controls the muscles of the jaw and carries sensory information from the face. Cranial nerve 6, the abducens nerve, is a motor nerve that controls muscles of the eye. Cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, controls facial muscles and carries sensory information from the tongue. Cranial nerve 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve, carries sensory information from the ear. Cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve, contains sensory and motor fibers that project to and from the pharynx. Cranial nerve 10, the vagus, controls the functions of the internal organs. Cranial nerve 11, the spinal accessory nerve, controls the muscles of the neck and back. Finally, cranial nerve 12, the hypoglossal, controls the muscles in the tongue. This figure depicts several segments of the human spinal cord. The spinal cord transmits messages to and from the brain and acts as a reflex center. The white matter is composed of myelinated nerve tracts that allow communication between various regions of the brain and spinal cord. The gray matter contains neuronal cell bodies and dendrites. It forms the central region of the spinal cord. Sensory fibers from the periphery enter the spinal cord through the dorsal root, and motor fibers exit the spinal cord through the ventral root. The dorsal root ganglion contains the cell bodies of sensory neurons. Spinal nerves contain both motor and sensory fibers, and each serves a specific region of the body.
Okay. And so with that, we're going to start talking about kind of the nerves and the PNS and the functions of the PNS, right? So we've already mentioned that the peripheral nervous system has somatic neurons, motor neurons, or not somatic, but sensory neurons and motor neurons. And that carries information to and from the central nervous system. The sensory neurons also provide information for both the somatic and autonomic motor division of the PNS. And so what happens is you have your incoming information, right, that comes to the central nervous system. And that comes in through those electrical impulses, which are action potentials. And so they come from the sensory neurons throughout the body. And then the central nervous system will, do whatever it needs to do with those action potentials. They'll send it up to the brain, or sometimes it could be a reflex that doesn't even need to go to the brain. And it can actually propagate through, say, an interneuron to a motor neuron and go directly to the target muscle or target cell and create a response without even going, say, to the brain. And looking at the somatic and autonomic motor divisions. So we've mentioned this briefly in the first video. The somatic division is what voluntary muscles, controlling your skeletal muscles. So we have a conscious control over the somatic division of those muscles. Now, there are some involuntary reflexes that exist. So, for example, the spinal reflex is mediated by the spinal cord and spinal nerves and uses very little kind of information or relaying to the brain. And it's kind of contained in the area of those spinal nerves in terms of where that information travels. And so in this reflex, you have what's known as a flexor, which is a withdrawal reflex, a cross extensor reflex, and then a stretch reflex. So this is really important for kind of maintaining posture and your movement. But we'll kind of look at the flexor and extensor reflex here in this example. So let's say you're walking barefoot and you happen to step on something painful, whether it's a glass, a nail, a sharp object, a sand spur, thistle stars, whatever it is. And that painful stimulus is sent through your sensory neuron to the spinal cord, across an inner neuron, and that inner neuron is stimulating motor neurons on both sides of the body, and it sends some signals to the brain. But remember, with reflexes, very little stimuli or signals are sent to the brain, and it actually can kind of be contained in this little unit area. And so once it travels the inner neuron, it's then sent to the motor neuron, so one across the spine, one kind of on the same side, and then that information goes through to the effector. So whatever the target cell is going to be for the response to that stimulus. And so in this case, the flexor reflex will withdraw the right leg. So it will pull that leg upwards away from that painful stimulus so that it doesn't do any more damage. And then the cross extensor reflex, which is the reflex going to the left leg, basically tells the left leg to extend and to get ready to hold the weight of the body as the right leg is going to lift up. And so that happens really, really quickly, right? And so you don't even have to think about it because that reflex is doing that, right? So that information is transported that quickly from the sensory nerve through the inner neuron to the motor neurons to the effector muscles to cause that type of reflexor response. And here we have another little animation that kind of goes over that as well.
Reflexes are fast, automatic nervous system responses triggered by specific stimuli. A reflex arc is the neural wiring of a single reflex. A reflex arc consists of a sensory receptor, a sensory neuron, usually at least one interneuron, a motor neuron, and an effector, in this case a muscle. In response to a painful stimulus, sensory messages are carried to the spinal cord by a sensory neuron. Interneurons, which can be either excitatory or inhibitory, integrate information from sensory neurons and stimulate the appropriate motor neurons, which in turn stimulate the appropriate muscles. Because muscles work in antagonistic pairs, one muscle must contract while the other relaxes. In this case, muscles in the back of the thigh contract while those in the front relax, causing the foot to lift away from the painful stimulus.
All right. So now moving into the autonomic division, where this is the part of the peripheral nervous system that is controlled automatically by our body. And so, this is the control of internal organs, heartbeat, reaction, all of that stuff. Okay. And like we mentioned, the autonomic division, this automatic division, can be split into two subdivisions. One is the sympathetic division, and the other is the parasympathetic division. Now, like I mentioned in the first video, these are part of the fight or flight responses. And so the sympathetic motor neurons and parasympathetic neurons basically innervate or cover each organ. And they target a lot of the smooth muscles in our body, the cardiac muscles, so our heart, and all of the internal organs, because each of these divisions have specific responses on a lot of our organs in our body based off of specific stimuli. Okay? So, for example, the sympathetic division prepares our body for those flight responses, right? So those kind of scared, emergency-based responses. And the neurotransmitter that's really important for kind of generating these stimuli is norepinephrine. And so this produces that fight or flight response. So it's like whenever you get really amped up or scared or on edge, your heart rate increases, your respiration, your breathing rate increases, your blood pressure rises, your pupils become dilated, so they get larger, your digestion slows down, urine production slows down, and your body's functions kind of slow down, so that you can, get out of whatever situation you're in. And so all the organs are generally getting this response in unison. So it's this unified response. And the sympathetic division generates responses that are opposite of the parasympathetic division. Division is that fight or flight response. The parasympathetic division is that relaxation response. So it directly opposes the responses of the sympathetic division. And the neurotransmitter for the parasympathetic neurons is acetylcholine. So parasympathetic will do the opposite of sympathetic, and it will lower your heart rate, lower your respiration rate, decrease your blood pressure, increases digestion. It allows your body to kind of continue its kind of defecation and urination processes, and it kind of doesn't stop those. Because you're relaxed, you're not on edge, you don't have to worry about anything, so your body's functions kind of go back to normal. And so the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions are really important for maintaining homeostasis. And so they're basically working against one another, or what we say antagonistically with one another, in order to create this homeostatic environment for in our body. So this figure shows the different responses for sympathetic and parasympathetic. So you've got, constricting when you're relaxing, dilating pupils, decrease in a lot of your bodily functions. So like salivation, digestion, urination, defecation decreases, but you get higher blood pressure, faster heart rate, faster respiration rate. The opposite for parasympathetic, so increases salivation, increases digestion, defecation, but decreases blood pressure, your heart rate, and your respiration rate. So this table just kind of shows the neurotransmitter that is important for the different divisions. So somatic, so the one we control the skeletal muscles, remember from the muscle lecture, acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is also important for parasympathetic. norepinephrine is sympathetic. Number of neurons required to reach target cell. So it's 2 for the sympathetic and parasympathetic, so the autonomic, 1 for the somatic, and then its functions, skeletal muscles versus fight or flight or relaxation. All right, so here we have a final video, just kind of going over those, or not, yeah, final animation in this video, as we're going over the different autonomic divisions, so the parasympathetic and the sympathetic.
The autonomic nervous system consists of 2 branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. The nerves of the parasympathetic division emerge from the brain stem, cranial nerves, and from the sacral segment of the spinal cord. The sympathetic nerves emerge from the spinal cord through the thoracic and lumbar segments. Both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems send nerve fibers to most, but not all, internal organs. The cell bodies of autonomic neurons are found in a series of ganglia located outside the CNS. In the sympathetic division, most of these ganglia are located in a chain just outside the spinal column. In the parasympathetic nervous system, the ganglia are located closer to the target organs. These post-ganglionic neurons of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system are innervated by preganglionic neurons that are located within the brain stem and spinal cord. When both systems send nerves to a given organ, they have opposite or antagonistic effects on its function. If one system stimulates, the other system inhibits. The antagonistic effects are brought about by different neurotransmitters. Whereas sympathetic neurons release mostly norepinephrine at their target organs, parasympathetic neurons release acetylcholine at their target organs. In general, the sympathetic nervous system is most active during a crisis, for example, the fight or flight response, while the parasympathetic nervous system is most active during visceral functions, permitting the organism to digest food and build up metabolic resources during periods of rest.
All right, so that's it for this video. So we're going to stop this video here, and we'll pick up with our final video where we're going to look at the central nervous system, so the brain and the spinal cord, and we'll talk all about kind of the functions of the brain, the spinal cord, and the different components of each.